If you had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting in a hospital waiting room, not as a patient, not as a worried friend, but as the woman whose world was quietly falling apart while everyone else smiled and passed around a newborn, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have laughed, probably. I would have said, no, I'm past the hard part. The hard part is behind me. Because that's what I had been telling myself every single morning for 14 months. That I was healing. That I was okay. That I had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to me and come out the other side. And then I walked into that hospital room and heard the name. Caleb. My sister named her baby Caleb. I want you to sit with that for a second before I keep going. Because the first thing people say when I tell this story is, well, it's just a name. And yes, technically, it is just a name. There are thousands of men named Caleb in this country. It is a perfectly normal name. A biblical name, even. And I understand, logically, that my sister is allowed to name her child whatever she wants. But this was not just a name, and I think somewhere deep down, everyone in that room knew it. Because the way my mother's eyes flicked to me for just a half second when my sister announced it, that quick, guilty glance she tried to cover with a smile, told me everything. They knew. They had probably known for months. And nobody called me. Nobody warned me. Nobody thought to pick up the phone and say, hey, just so you know, before you walk in there with your flowers and your forced smile, there's something you should be prepared for. I stood in that doorway holding a bouquet. I had picked out that morning at the grocery store, sunflowers, because my sister used to say sunflowers were her favorite, and I felt the expression leave my face. Not slowly. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug, and I had to drop my eyes to the floor just to stop the room from seeing what was happening to me in real time. Nobody noticed. Or maybe they did and just decided it was easier not to. That's the thing about being the woman in the family who has been through something hard. After a while, people stop asking how you are. Not because they don't care, but because your pain became inconvenient. It interrupted dinners. It made holidays complicated. It required them to take a side, and taking a side meant one of them had to be wrong. So instead, they all just quietly agreed to move on. To act like the last 2 years had been a minor weather event. Something unpleasant that had passed. And now we were all standing in the sunshine again. Except I was standing in a hospital room holding sunflowers with my ex-husband's name ringing in my ears. Caleb. The man I was married to for 6 years. The man who stood at an altar and made promises in front of every single person in that room. The man I built a life with, shared an apartment with, argued over furniture with, stayed up late with when his mother was sick, held his hand through more than I ever talk about publicly. Because that's what wives do. That man, the one who, when I finally found out the truth, didn't even try to explain himself. Just sat there and let the silence confirm everything. 6 years, and when it ended, the people who were supposed to be in my corner spent more energy telling me to keep perspective than they ever spent actually sitting with me in the pain. I filed for divorce and I rebuilt my life piece by piece, the way you do when you realize nobody is coming to rescue you. I went back to therapy. I started running again, which I hadn't done since college. I repainted my apartment a color I actually liked instead of the beige Caleb had picked because he said it was cleaner. I made new friends. I said yes to things that scared me. I cried in my car more times than I can count, and then I wiped my face and kept going. And I thought I was far enough away from it. I genuinely thought that, until I wasn't. Because grief doesn't follow a straight line. It doesn't politely wait for you to feel ready before it comes back. It finds you in hospital waiting rooms and grocery store, parking lots and quiet Sunday mornings when you thought you'd finally made peace with things. It finds you in the sound of a name spoken softly by a nurse, followed by a room full of people smiling like nothing in that moment is extraordinary at all. I stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably only seconds. Long enough to understand that I was not going to be able to hold my face together if I stayed. Long enough to realize that no one in that room was going to acknowledge what had just happened. Long enough to know that if I opened my mouth, whatever came out was not going to be something I could take back. So I didn't. I set the sunflowers on the windowsill near the window. I said something quiet about not feeling well, and I walked out. The elevator doors closed, and I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. And in the reflection of those metal doors, I looked at myself, really looked, and I made a quiet decision. I was done being the one who kept the peace. I was done swallowing things to make other people comfortable. I was done showing up with sunflowers for people who had looked me in the eye and chosen, over and over again, to act like my pain did not matter. The elevator hit the ground floor. I walked to my car. And somewhere between the lobby and the parking garage, the woman I used to be, the one who always said sorry first, who always found a way to understand everyone else's side, who always made herself smaller so the room could breathe easier, she stayed behind. I didn't miss her. Not even a little. Before you can understand what that name meant to me, you have to understand what Caleb actually was. Not who he appeared to be on the outside, because on the outside, Caleb was the kind of man everyone liked. Charming without trying too hard. The type who remembered your coffee order and asked about your mom by name. The type who made you feel, when he looked at you, like you were genuinely the most interesting person in the room. I know how that sounds. I know every woman who has ever been betrayed by someone says some version of that. But I need you to understand it, because the charm was not incidental. The charm was the whole strategy, even if he never consciously knew it. I met him when I was 24. I was working a job I didn't love yet. Living in a city I was still figuring out, and carrying that specific kind of loneliness that you can't explain to people who haven't felt it, the kind where you're surrounded by people and still somehow feel invisible. And then there was Caleb. Funny, warm, present. He made everything feel lighter. 2 years later, we got married. I want to be honest about those early years, because I think it matters. It wasn't all bad. That's the complicated truth that people don't want to sit with when a marriage ends. It's easier to say he was always terrible, always a red flag, always wrong for me. But that's not what happened. For the first 3 years, I was genuinely happy. Not perfect, no marriages, but real. We cooked dinner together on Sunday nights. We argued about small things and figured out how to apologize. We talked about the future like it was somewhere we were both going. I loved him. I want to say that clearly, because it's important to the story. I loved him the way you love someone when you've decided they're your person. Completely. With the kind of trust that doesn't protect itself because it doesn't think it needs to. That's what made it so devastating when I found out. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically, a Tuesday in November, the kind of cold gray afternoon where the light dies early, and everything feels slightly off without you knowing why. I picked up his phone to check the time because mine was charging across the room. And a message came through. I didn't mean to read it. I want to say that, because it's true. But I read it, and then I read the one above it, and the one above that. And then, I was sitting on the edge of our bed, scrolling back through months of a conversation that rewrote everything I thought I knew about my own life. Her name doesn't matter. What matters is that I had met her. At his office Christmas party, almost a year before. She had hugged me. She had told me I was sweet. She had smiled at me with the kind of warmth that I now understood was the specific warmth of someone who is deeply, privately glad you have no idea what she knows. He had been seeing her for 11 months. I sat with that phone in my hands for a long time. Long enough that Caleb came looking for me, and found me, and saw what I was holding. And even then, even standing there caught, he didn't fall apart. He didn't cry. He didn't get down on his knees and beg. He just stood in the doorway and exhaled slowly, like a man who had been waiting for something to finally be over. He said, "You've been so focused on your career." I felt alone. That was his explanation. That was the sentence he had apparently prepared for the moment I found out. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I don't know what's wrong with me." Not "please." Just "you made me feel alone, so I found someone who didn't." I want to tell you I screamed. I want to tell you I threw something, or said something that cut him the way he'd cut me. But I didn't. I just looked at him. And I think that look scared him more than anything else I could have done, because it wasn't anger. It was the face of a woman who had just understood something she could not unknow. I called a divorce attorney 3 days later. And this is the part of the story where I expected my family to show up. Where I expected the people who had known me my entire life, who had sat at that wedding, who had watched me build that marriage, who had watched me try, to close ranks around me and say, "We see you, we believe you, we're here." Instead, my mother asked if we had considered counseling. My father said men make mistakes, and that doesn't mean the marriage is over. And my sister looked me in the eye and said, "You know how hard it is to find a good man, right? Are you sure you want to throw this away?" Throw this away. Like I was being impulsive. Like I had found a parking ticket and decided to burn the car down. Like 11 months of texts to another woman was something a reasonable person might weigh against the inconvenience of starting over. I remember driving home from that conversation and sitting in my car outside my apartment for a long time. Not crying, just sitting, processing the specific loneliness of being failed by everyone at once. And I made myself a promise that night. I said, I will get through this. Not because anyone is coming to help me. Not because my family is going to show up the way I needed them to. But because I am still here, and I still have myself, and that is going to have to be enough. It was enough. Eventually. But it cost me more than it should have. And the people who made it cost that much. They were still in that hospital room, smiling, passing around a baby named Caleb. Like none of it ever happened. Like I was never worth the truth. There is a specific kind of betrayal that doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock on the door and introduce itself. It seeps in slowly, quietly. Through the cracks of things you almost noticed, but talked yourself out of. Through the conversations that ended a little too fast. Through the silences that felt slightly heavier than they should have. Through the moments where your gut said something, and your brain said you're being paranoid. And you chose your brain because choosing your gut would have meant blowing up your entire world. And you weren't ready for that yet. That's how it was with my sister. Her name is Vanessa. She's 2 years younger than me. Growing up, we were close the way sisters are when they don't have much choice. Same house, same parents, same dinner table every night. We fought constantly and made up quickly. We borrowed each other's clothes without asking and denied it to our mother's face. We had the kind of shorthand that only exists between people who were formed in the same place. And I loved her. I want to say that before I say anything else. I loved her the way you love someone who has been woven into your life, since before you had the vocabulary to describe what love even was. But Vanessa had always had a complicated relationship with my life specifically. Not in a way she ever said out loud. In a way that lived in small comments. In a way that surfaced as jokes that weren't quite jokes. When I got a promotion, she said, "Wow, must be nice to be the overachiever." When I bought my first car, she said, "Look at you, so independent." And when I got engaged to Caleb, when I called her from the jewelry store parking lot, voice shaking with happiness, she paused for just a second too long before she said congratulations. Just a half second. I filed it away and forgot about it. I shouldn't have forgotten about it. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from a mutual friend. She mentioned, the way people mention things they're not sure they should mention, that she had seen Vanessa having coffee with Caleb. Downtown. At a corner table. Laughing, I felt the floor shift under me. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way it does when something you were hoping wasn't true turns out to be true. I called Vanessa that night. I kept my voice calm. I said I'd heard she'd seen Caleb, and I just wanted to understand what that was about. And she, without hesitating, without even a pause that might suggest she understood why I was asking, said they were just friends. She said I was reading into things. She said, and I will never forget the exact words, "Not everything is about you, you know. Not everything is about you." From my sister. About my ex-husband, whom she was having coffee with 6 months after he cheated on me and I filed for divorce. I didn't push it. And I have asked myself 100 times since then why I didn't push it. Why I let that answer stand. Why I said okay and changed the subject and got off the phone and told myself she was probably right. I was probably being sensitive. I needed to stop looking for problems where there weren't any. I think the honest answer is that I was tired. I had spent so much energy surviving the divorce, the paperwork, the splitting of things, the therapy, the rebuilding, that I simply did not have anything left to spend on a new fight. Especially not a fight with my sister. Especially not one that I couldn't prove. So I let it go. I tucked it into the same drawer where I kept all the other things I wasn't ready to look at directly. And I moved on. I went to her baby shower 4 months later. I bought a gift from her registry, a nice one. I sat at a table with relatives I hadn't seen in years and I smiled and I played the games and I oohed over the tiny clothes. I was present. I was kind. I was the version of myself that shows up and performs okay, even when she isn't entirely okay. Because that's what you do. Because that's what family requires. Because you love someone even when something between you feels unresolved and strange. What I did not know, what nobody told me, was that the name had already been chosen by then. That Vanessa already knew, sitting across from me at that baby shower, eating cake and accepting my gift, what she was going to name her child. That she looked at me that afternoon and said nothing. I think about that a lot. The specific cruelty of that silence. Not the name itself, though the name is what broke something open, but the silence at the baby shower. The choice to look at me, to accept my presence and my gift and my love, and to say nothing. To let me walk in blind. To let me find out the way I found out, standing in a hospital room, unprepared, in front of everyone. That was not an accident. That was a decision. And the thing about finally understanding that someone made a deliberate decision to hurt you, not out of anger, not in a moment of heat, but slowly, quietly, with full knowledge of what they were doing, is that it changes the way you see everything that came before it. Every reassurance. Every, you're being paranoid. Every, not everything is about you. It was always about something. I just wasn't asking the right questions. I walked out of that hospital room because I finally understood something I had been avoiding for 2 years. Some people do not love you the way you love them, and no amount of showing up, forgiving, shrinking, or staying quiet is going to change that. The only thing left to do was stop pretending otherwise. And so I did. My phone started buzzing before I even reached the elevator. I heard it through my bag, that rapid, insistent vibration that means multiple messages coming in fast, one after another, the kind of pattern that tells you something has already been decided about you before you even have a chance to speak. I didn't look at it right away. I pressed the elevator button and watched the numbers count down, and I breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way my therapist taught me, when the world starts closing in, and you need to remind your body that it is still safe, that you are still here, that you get to decide what happens next. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. And then I looked. 14 messages in 4 minutes. My mother had sent 3. My aunt had sent 2. 2 cousins I barely spoke to had sent 1 each. And Vanessa, my sister, the woman who had just given birth, who was lying in a hospital bed 12 hours after delivering a child, had sent 4. I read them in order, slowly, standing in an elevator while it descended to the parking level. My mother, where did you go? Your sister is asking for you. My mother again, this is not the time. Please come back upstairs. My mother again, people are noticing you're gone. My aunt, I don't know what's going on, but this is not the place for drama. And then Vanessa. 4 messages from a woman who had just pushed a human being into the world, and apparently still had enough energy left to pick up her phone and type. Vanessa. Really? Vanessa, you couldn't just be happy for me for one day. Vanessa, I knew you'd make this about yourself somehow. Vanessa, typical. I read that last one twice. Typical, one word. Delivered with the confidence of someone who has already written the story, assigned the roles, and decided how it ends. I was the dramatic one. I was the one who couldn't let things go. I was the one making this about myself, not the woman who had named her child after my ex-husband. Me. The elevator hit the parking level. The doors opened. I walked to my car and I got in, and I sat there in the dim yellow light of the garage, and I read every single message one more time. Not because I was going to respond, but because I wanted to understand something. I wanted to see, clearly, without flinching, who these people actually were when the pressure was on. And what I saw was this: not one of them asked if I was okay. Not one. Not my mother, who had watched me go through the divorce. Not my aunt, who had called me 3 times during the first month, after I found out, just to check in. Not any of the cousins, and certainly not Vanessa. Not a single person in that chain of 14 messages had typed the words "Are you okay?" or even "What happened?" Every single message was about managing me, about getting me back in line, about making sure that whatever I was feeling didn't inconvenience the occasion. That told me everything. I turned my phone off. Not on silent. Off, completely dark, and I drove home. The drive took 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. I needed something concrete to hold on to, and the clock was the most concrete thing available. 22 minutes of streetlights and quiet radio, and the strange, hollow feeling that comes after something breaks. Not the sharp pain of the break itself, but the silence after. The moment when the noise stops and you're left alone with the reality of what just happened. I got home. I locked the door behind me. I filled the kettle and stood at my kitchen counter waiting for it to boil, and I stared at the tile backsplash I had chosen myself. After the divorce, when I repainted and reorganized and rebuilt my apartment into a place that felt like mine again. And I let myself feel it. All of it. Not the performed version of feeling it. Not the filtered version I would have shown in public, the real version. The ugly, unpolished version that doesn't make for a clean story. I felt humiliated. I felt used. I felt the specific grief of realizing that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally have been loving you conditionally all along. The condition being that you stay manageable, that you stay quiet, that you absorb whatever is handed to you, without making it awkward for everyone else. And underneath all of that, deeper, quieter, more honest, I felt something shift. Because there is a point in every person's life where the pain stops being just pain and starts becoming clarity. Where you stop asking why they treated you this way and start asking why you kept accepting it. Where the grief turns, slowly, into something harder and cleaner and far more useful. I had been the peacekeeper in my family for as long as I could remember. The one who called first after a fight. The one who found the diplomatic thing to say. The one who absorbed and forgave and showed up and tried again. I had mistaken that for strength. I had mistaken the ability to keep going back for resilience. But sitting on my kitchen floor that night, with a cup of tea going cold beside me, I understood for the first time that there is a difference between resilience and compliance. Resilience is getting back up. Compliance is letting people knock you down and thanking them for the lesson. I had been compliant for a very long time. 14 messages. Not one asking if I was okay. I didn't need anything else. I didn't need a bigger sign or a longer list or more evidence. I had all the information I needed, delivered in 4 minutes by the people who claimed to love me most. And I decided, sitting on that floor, that I was going to stop making it easy for them. Starting now. The next morning I woke up and did not call anyone back. I want you to understand how significant that was for me, because it probably sounds simple. It probably sounds like the obvious thing to do. But for someone who had spent her entire adult life being the first to reach out, the first to smooth things over, the first to pick up the phone and say, "I'm sorry," even when she had nothing to apologize for, not calling back was an act of enormous will. It went against something so deeply wired in me that my hand actually reached for my phone twice, before 8 in the morning, out of pure muscle memory. Twice I picked it up. Twice I put it back down. I did not call. I did not text. I did not send an explanation or an apology or a carefully worded message designed to manage everyone's feelings while quietly burying my own. I did nothing. I made coffee. I sat by my window, and I let the silence stand. My mother called at 9. I watched her name light up the screen and I let it ring out. She called again at 9:45. I let that one go too. My aunt sent a message asking if I was all right, which was the first time anyone had asked that question. And I noticed how it landed differently than the messages from the night before, softer, more genuine, but I still didn't respond. Not yet. I needed the quiet. I needed to stay inside myself long enough to figure out what I actually thought and felt before I let anyone else's voice into my head. What I did instead was this: I got out a notebook. An actual paper notebook. The kind I used to keep in college, when I was still figuring out who I was, and writing felt like the only way to sort through it. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote for almost 2 hours. Not in any organized way. Not a letter or a list or a plan. Just everything. Every memory. Every moment I had let slide. Every time someone in my family had handed me a version of events that didn't match my own experience, and I had accepted their version because it was easier than fighting for the truth of mine. It was a long 2 hours. What came out of it was something I hadn't expected. I thought writing it all down would make me angrier. I thought it would sharpen the edges of everything, make the betrayal feel more acute, leave me sitting in a pile of righteous rage by lunchtime. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that. What happened was something closer to grief, a deep, honest grief for the relationship I had wanted with my family and had never quite had. For the sister I thought Vanessa was, and the sister she had shown herself to be. For the years I had spent working so hard to keep everyone comfortable that I had never stopped to ask whether anyone was working to keep me comfortable in return. The answer, written out across 4 pages of a notebook, was clearly no. And once I saw it written down, once I could look at it clearly, outside of my own head, something released. Not fully, not permanently, but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to think. I turned to a fresh page and I wrote 2 lists. The first list was everything I had been giving this family. Showing up to every birthday, every holiday, every hospital visit. Buying the gifts. Making the calls. Being the first to apologize. Finding a way to understand everyone else's perspective even when no one extended me the same. Keeping quiet in moments that deserved noise. Shrinking in conversations so that Vanessa could feel bigger. So that my mother didn't have to navigate tension. So that the dinner table stayed peaceful and everyone could go home feeling fine. The second list was everything they had given me in return over the past 2 years specifically. During the hardest period of my life. During the divorce and the rebuilding and the slow, painful work of putting yourself back together when the life you planned has collapsed underneath you. The second list was very short. I sat with those 2 lists for a long time. I didn't feel angry looking at them. I felt something colder and clearer than anger. I felt the specific lucidity that arrives when you stop lying to yourself about something you've known for a while but weren't ready to face. I had been operating under a set of assumptions that weren't true. I had assumed that because these people were my family, because we shared blood and history and a childhood, they were on my side in some fundamental way. I had assumed that their love, even when it was imperfect, was essentially oriented toward my well-being. I had assumed that the gaps and failures and dismissals were noise, painful noise, but not the signal itself. The 2 lists told me I had been wrong. The signal had been there the whole time. I had just been too loyal, or too hopeful, or too exhausted to read it clearly. That afternoon I did something I had been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't let myself do. I opened the family group chat, the one with 47 messages I hadn't read since the night before, and I left. No announcement. No farewell message. No explanation designed to make them understand or feel bad or react in some particular way. I just pressed leave and put my phone face down on the table. My mother called within 10 minutes. I let it go to voicemail. I want to be precise about something, because I think it matters. I was not punishing anyone. Punishment implies you want the other person to feel the consequence, that you're watching for the reaction, that their suffering is in some way the point. That was not what this was. This was quieter than punishment. This was simply me, finally, after years of contorting myself to fit inside a dynamic that was never built for my comfort, stepping out of it. The group chat had 47 unread messages. I had 0. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the quiet felt like mine. And I was keeping it. 3 weeks after the hospital, I got a call from my cousin Diane. Diane is 10 years older than me. She has always been the kind of person who operates outside the family's usual rules. The one who says the thing everyone else is thinking, who doesn't soften the edges to protect feelings, who calls a situation what it is instead of what everyone agrees to pretend it is. Growing up, I found her a little intimidating. As an adult, I had come to understand that what I was actually sensing was integrity. The specific discomfort of being near someone who refuses to perform. She called on a Thursday evening. I almost didn't pick up. I had been keeping my world small and quiet those 3 weeks, going to work, going to therapy, running in the mornings, cooking simple dinners and reading actual books in actual silence and slowly, carefully remembering what it felt like to live without constant noise in my chest. The phone felt like an intrusion. But something made me answer. She said, "I think you need to know something. And I need you to hear me out before you say anything." I sat down. She told me about the baby shower. My baby shower, the one I had attended 4 months earlier, the one where I had smiled and played the games and passed around the gift I had bought from the registry. She told me that at some point during the afternoon, while I was talking to someone across the room, Vanessa had made a comment to a small group of relatives gathered near the dessert table. Diane had been standing close enough to hear. Vanessa had said that she had always liked Caleb, that she had never understood why I ended the marriage, that she thought I had thrown away a good man over something I could have worked through, that the baby's name was a tribute, her word, tribute, to someone she respected and admired. Diane paused after she said that. She let it sit in the air between us for a moment. I didn't say anything. I was doing the thing I had trained myself to do in therapy when information arrives that is large and sharp and needs a second to land without cutting you on the way in. I breathed. I let it exist. I didn't immediately try to process or respond or make it smaller than it was. Diane said, "Nobody said anything. I want you to know that." The group just kind of went quiet, and then someone changed the subject. "Nobody defended you. I'm including myself in that, and I'm not proud of it." I should have said something then. I'm saying something now. I asked her why she was telling me 3 weeks later, and not in the moment or right after. She said she had been wrestling with it. She said she wasn't sure it was her place. She said she had convinced herself that maybe I didn't need to know, that knowing would only make things harder. And then she said that she heard my mother telling relatives that I had walked out of the hospital to cause drama, and that my mother's version of events was spreading through the family like it was fact. And she couldn't stay quiet anymore. That last part landed differently than everything else. Because I had known, somewhere underneath everything, that my absence from that hospital room was going to be rewritten. That was how this family operated. Inconvenient truths got softened and complicated truths got simplified, and anything that made someone look bad got quietly reassigned until the story was clean enough to live with. I had watched it happen my entire life with smaller things. I should not have been surprised to see it happening now. But knowing something intellectually and hearing it confirmed out loud are two very different experiences. My mother was telling people I left to cause drama. Not that I left because my sister named her child after my ex-husband. Not that I left because I was blindsided in a room full of people who had apparently all known and said nothing. Not that I left because I was standing there holding sunflowers and trying not to fall apart in public. Just drama. The implication being that I am the kind of woman who manufactures crises for attention. That my pain is a performance. That I walked out of that room because I wanted to, not because I had to. I thanked Deanne. I meant it. She had done something that cost her something. She had stepped outside the family's agreement to let the comfortable version of events stand, and she had told me the truth instead. That is not a small thing. In a family that runs on managed narratives, honesty is a form of courage. After I hung up, I sat for a long time with the full picture assembled in front of me for the first time. The name was not careless. The name was a statement. Vanessa had looked at my pain, at 6 years of my life, at a marriage that ended, because I was betrayed, at the slow and difficult work of my recovery. And she had placed his name at the center of her family, like she was planting a flag. Like she was saying, "I choose his legacy over your healing." I choose my feelings about him over your feelings about everything that happened. And the room had gone quiet, and nobody had said a word. That is not a family that failed to notice. That is a family that noticed and decided the path of least resistance was silence. I used to believe that silence in a moment like that was neutral. That it was simply the absence of action. I don't believe that anymore. Silence in a moment that calls for someone to speak is its own kind of answer. It tells you exactly where you stand. It tells you that keeping the peace matters more than keeping faith with you. I had the answer now. Clearly. Written in the quiet of every person who stood near that dessert table and changed the subject. I was not someone this family was going to protect. That meant I had to protect myself. And I finally fully, without hesitation, understood what that was going to require. People always want the confrontation scene. I understand why. We are wired for it. We have watched enough movies and read enough stories to know that the moment of reckoning is supposed to be loud. The wronged woman is supposed to stand up at the dinner table, or send the devastating text, or show up at the door and finally say every single thing she has been swallowing for years, and the person who hurt her is supposed to crumble. Cry. Apologize. Understand. And then justice arrives, clean and satisfying, like the last note of a song that has been building for 3 acts. I want to tell you that is not what happened. And I want to tell you why I am more at peace with how it actually went than I would have been with the movie version. After Diane's call, I gave myself 2 days. Not to plan something dramatic. Just to sit with everything and make sure that whatever I did next was coming from a clear place and not a reactive one. My therapist has a phrase she uses: responding versus reacting. Reacting is what your nervous system does when it's been triggered, fast, hot, driven by pain. Responding is what you do when you've let the dust settle enough to see clearly. I had spent too many years reacting to things and calling it strength. I wanted to respond this time. On the third day, I wrote Vanessa a message. One message. I drafted it 4 times. Not because I was struggling to find the words, but because I kept catching myself writing things that were designed to wound rather than to close. And I didn't want to wound her. I want to be honest about that, not because I had forgiven her, but because I understood that trying to hurt her back would keep me tethered to her. It would mean she still had power over my emotional life, and I was done giving people power over my emotional life who had not earned it and did not deserve it. The final version said, I know the name was intentional. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt. I'm also not going to fight you for an apology you're not capable of giving. I'm choosing to step back from this relationship indefinitely. I wish you and your family well. I read it one more time. Then I sent it. Her response came within 20 minutes. A full paragraph. Words like toxic and clearly not healed, and maybe one day you'll be able to be happy for someone other than yourself. The language of someone who has been caught and responded by going on offense. The language of someone who knows, somewhere underneath the defensiveness, that she is in the wrong and has decided that the best way to manage that knowledge is to make me the villain instead. I read it once. I did not respond. I set my phone down and I went for a run. That was it. That was the confrontation. One message sent, one message received. One decision made to let the last word be hers because I didn't need the last word. I needed the exit. And here is the thing I want you to understand about justice. Because I think we get it wrong. We think justice is what happens to the other person. We think it lives in their consequence, their punishment, their moment of public reckoning. And sometimes it does. Sometimes the person who wronged you faces something real and visible, and the world gets to see it happen. But most of the time, in real life, in ordinary families, in the quiet betrayals that never make headlines, justice doesn't look like that. Justice is quieter, more personal. It lives not in what happens to them, but in what stops happening to you. The week after I sent that message, I called my therapist, and we had the most honest session we had ever had. I said things I had been circling for months. I named patterns I had been participating in. I took responsibility for the years I had spent prioritizing peace over honesty in my own life, because as much as I was hurt by what my family did, I had also been complicit in the dynamic. I had kept showing up. I had kept absorbing. I had kept performing fine. And I had to own that, not to let them off the hook, but because owning it was the only way to actually change it. Then I booked the trip. I had been talking about Portugal for 2 years. One of those things you put on a list and keep moving to the next season because something always comes up. Because it never feels like quite the right time. Because somewhere in the back of your mind you have decided you'll do it when things settle down. But things don't settle down. You have to settle yourself down and go anyway. I went alone. 1 week. A small hotel in Lisbon with a rooftop where I drank coffee every morning and watched the city wake up. Day trips to Sintra and Cascais. Long meals where I sat by myself with a book and a glass of wine and did not feel lonely, because loneliness is what you feel when you want company and don't have it. And I had finally learned the difference between that and solitude, which is what you feel when you are genuinely content in your own presence. On the last evening, I took a bus to a cliff on the western edge of Sintra where the land runs out, and there is nothing between you and the Atlantic Ocean. I stood there for a long time. The wind was cold. The water below was the kind of deep green that has no bottom you can see. And I thought about the woman who had stood in a hospital parking garage 4 months earlier, reading 14 messages that didn't once ask if she was okay. I felt genuinely light. Not healed completely. Not finished. Healing is not a destination you arrive at, it is a direction you keep choosing. But light. Lighter than I had been in years. Lighter than I knew I was allowed to be. Nobody gave me that lightness. Not a confrontation. Not an apology. Not Vanessa finally understanding what she had done. Not my mother calling with the right words at the right time. I built it myself. Out of boundaries and honesty, and one message sent and one trip booked, and one morning at a time of choosing myself over the noise. That is what justice actually looks like. It looks like you, standing on a cliff at the edge of the world, breathing clean air, finally free. It has been almost a year since that day in the hospital parking garage. A year is long enough to see things clearly. Long enough to stop second, guessing yourself and start trusting the decisions you made in the hard moments. The ones you made not from anger or impulsiveness, but from a deep, exhausted, finally honest understanding of what was true. A year is long enough to know whether you made the right call. And I know. I know the way you know something when you stop carrying it and realize how heavy it actually was. I have not spoken to Vanessa. Not once. No birthday message, no holiday text, no reaching out through a mutual relative to test the waters. Nothing. And I want to be clear about what that silence has cost me, because I think it would be dishonest to frame this as entirely painless. She is my sister. We shared a childhood. We shared a language that only we spoke, built from 1,000 small shared references and inside jokes and memories that belonged to no one else. Losing that, or rather, finally accepting that it was already gone long before I admitted it, is a grief that does not resolve cleanly. It sits in the background. Some days quieter, some days louder. It is the kind of loss that does not have a ceremony, no funeral, no casseroles dropped off by neighbors. Just absence where something used to be. I let myself grieve that. I think it matters to say so. Because sometimes people hear a story like mine, and they think the lesson is that walking away is easy once you see clearly. It is not easy. Clarity does not make it painless. It just makes it possible. My relationship with my parents is something I would describe as honest for the first time. Which sounds like a strange thing to say about your parents, but I think many people will understand what I mean. For most of my adult life, my relationship with them operated on a kind of mutual performance. They performed supportive, and I performed fine, and we met in the middle at a version of family that functioned as long as nobody pressed too hard on anything real. I ended that performance, not loudly, not with a speech or an ultimatum. I simply stopped pretending. I told my mother, directly and without cruelty, that what happened at the hospital hurt me and that her response in the days after made it worse. I told her that I needed her to understand that, not to apologize necessarily, though an apology would have been welcome, but just to understand it. To not rewrite it. To let the truth of what happened exist without immediately smoothing it, into something more comfortable. She struggled with that. She is a woman who was raised to keep things together, to prioritize surface harmony over interior honesty, and asking her to sit with discomfort is genuinely hard for her. But she tried. That counts for something. Our relationship now is smaller and more careful and more real than it has ever been. I call her on Sundays. We talk about actual things. It is not the mother-daughter relationship I wanted when I was younger, but it is one I can live inside honestly. And that matters more to me now than I ever thought it would. Some people in the extended family think I am cold now. Distant. Difficult. I have heard the word bitter used, filtered back to me through the particular telephone game that families play when someone steps out of the expected role. I used to care deeply about that kind of thing, about how I was perceived, about being liked, about not being the one who caused problems. I spent years managing my image within my family the way a publicist manages a brand. Carefully, exhaustingly, always anticipating how my actions would land and adjusting accordingly. I do not do that anymore. Not because I stopped caring about people, but because I finally understood the difference between caring about people and managing their perception of you. One is love. The other is fear, and I had been calling my fear love for a very long time. What my life looks like now is quieter and fuller at the same time, which sounds like a contradiction but isn't. Quieter because I removed so much noise, the family group chat, the obligatory appearances, the constant low-level anxiety of managing everyone's feelings. Fuller because the space that cleared out did not stay empty. It filled with things I actually chose. Friends I trust completely. Work I find genuinely meaningful. A version of my daily life that belongs to me in a way it never quite did when I was so busy fitting myself into everyone else's idea of who I should be. I still run in the mornings. I still see my therapist, though less frequently now. I have a small apartment that I love completely, painted in colors that make me happy, full of books I have actually read and plants I have actually kept alive. I cook real dinners on weeknights. I sleep well. These things sound small. They are not small. And I want to speak directly now to whoever is still watching, because I think you are here for a reason. I think some part of you recognized something in this story, maybe not the specific details, maybe not the sister or the name or the hospital room, but the feeling underneath it. The feeling of being the one who always absorbs. The one who always understands. The one who is told, over and over in different ways, to be smaller, to be quieter, to be more convenient, to stop making things complicated by having feelings that don't fit the version of events everyone else has agreed on. You are not dramatic. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You are someone who was handed a version of love that had conditions attached to it and told it was unconditional. And at some point you started to notice the conditions. And that noticing, that slow, painful, clarifying noticing, is not a problem to be fixed. It is the beginning of something. They called it overreacting. They called it drama. They called it bitter and cold and difficult and not healed. I call it waking up. And the thing about waking up, the real thing, the thing nobody tells you, is that it does not feel triumphant at first. It feels like loss. It feels like standing in a parking garage reading 14 messages and understanding for the first time how alone you have actually been. It feels like grief before it feels like freedom. But then, slowly, it starts to feel like something else. It feels like yourself, your actual self, the one that was always there underneath all the performing and absorbing and shrinking. The one that knew, even when you weren't ready to listen, exactly what you deserved and exactly what you were settling for. That woman does not go back to sleep. Not for anyone. Not ever again.